Hi, this is Christopher Perrin with another episode of the Christopher Perrin Show. This is a podcast episode, and it's a delight for me to talk again with Andrew Zwerneman. Andrew had a conversation with myself and some other colleagues about a month ago about American history. And as he was talking with passion and insight about the importance of studying American history and the reasons why we should do it and how we could do it better, and then weaving in his own insights of pedagogy, I just thought, well, I remember thinking at the time, I wish we were just recording this, because he just said some things that very few people can say the way he is able to, because of a long life of study of history and pedagogy and teaching and learning. So it just kind of oozes out of him, and I just thought it would be great if others could see that same thing. So I'm quite sure you will. So Andrew, I want to thank you for spending some time today for this conversation. I'd like you to just begin, if you wouldn't mind, by giving a little bit of a historical narrative. Where did you start your education? What got you excited about history? And then just, if you would, give us a little arc to how you got to be where you are right now, leading Cana Academy and America 250.
Thanks so much, Chris. I'm just very pleased to be here. I'm very honored that you would have me as a guest on your podcast. And I embrace wholeheartedly an opportunity to talk about history. I've been blessed myself to be raised in a family that took history seriously. My father was an economist. My mother studied English and biology, but they both loved history. And it so happens that my father had been in business, and then he went back to school and became an academician. And we traveled a lot as he built his second career. So we lived in California, Indiana, Texas, Massachusetts, North Carolina, and New Mexico, where I graduated from high school. And along the way, they took us everywhere they could, to museums, to national monuments. So I remember, visiting places like Boston, going to Stowe, Vermont. We met Maria von Trapp in the early 60s. Most of my people are from Texas, so we spent a lot of time in Texas. And I had a great uncle who was a legislator in the State House of Representatives. Had a great uncle who was a medic in the Union Army, sort of broke from the Texans and was on the Union side of the war, things like that. All that was sort of floating around in our family. I would say the most formative jump into history proper, though, came in 5th grade. So we were living in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and my parents sent me to a school in Durham called Durham Academy, which was a wonderful little private academy. And a 75-year-old woman in her last year of teaching happened to be my English and history teacher. Her name was Edna Constable. She was a wonderful woman. She was about 4'10", and the daughter of a Baptist minister. And she taught us the history of North Carolina. That was the first time that I had taken a serious dive into the Civil War. And so I confronted for the first time in my young life the carnage of war and the cruelties of slavery. This made a lasting impact on me. I had another great teacher in 9th grade, Mrs. Blake, and this was in Las Cruces, New Mexico, and I had to do my first serious research project. And I studied an event where Pancho Villa came across the border and raided Columbus, New Mexico. He had been upset by the realignment of international relationships between the Mexican and American governments. So to get revenge, he came across, shot the place up. And my dad and I went down there and spent a day at Columbus, seeing the artifacts and taking in the terrain. It was just terribly interesting to me. And then I had a high school teacher who was my speech teacher, but he was a veteran of the Chosin Reservoir Battle, which is one of the most storied battles in Marine Corps history in the Korean War. And he had a huge impact on me. Among other things, he taught me how to write and how to speak in public. But his stories about the war were amazing, and he wed them to his faith. And we learned about it on a Wednesday before Thanksgiving in 1975. The kids asked, Mr. Gaines, where are you going to be tomorrow? And he said, well, I'm going to start my day by going to Mass. And we all scratched our heads about that, even the Catholics in the crowd. So, why are you going to Mass tomorrow? And he said, well, and he told us the story of the battle, and a number of his colleagues had died around him. And he struck a bargain. He told guys that if you get me out of this alive, I will go to Mass every Thanksgiving Thursday the rest of my life. And he was a great man, a heroic man, and a very generous teacher. These were the kind of people who had a big impact on me. And I went to college, and I became a history major, and I had a handful of wonderful scholars. They were just beautiful human beings. None of them wore their politics on their sleeve. They really didn't wear their religion on their sleeve, but they were all trained in what we would call the liberal discipline of history. They were true to the past for what it was. They were observational. They looked at the past for what actually happened, and they were sympathetic to the human condition. So later on, when I would write, just 5 years ago, when I wrote that little book, History Forgotten and Remembered, the habits that I encourage teachers to foster among their students are the habits that my teachers fostered and my professors fostered in me.
So is it a tradition of teaching and learning passed to you? And no doubt they had received it from their teachers, and you found it formative and good enough that it stayed with you, and you've tried to pass it on to those you train and teach.
Yeah.
But could you talk about how that happened? Because you ended up going, I know you did a master's degree as well, so you did, further studying history, and then you ended up starting schools. I hope you'll get there.
Yeah, actually, my wife helped start a school in South Bend, Indiana in 1981, and I was working as a journalist in New York City. I was interested in dating her and courting her, so I took a trip back, and she invited me to her family's house for dinner, and at the end of dinner, leaned across the table and said, we could use a guy like you at our school. This was the Trinity School at Greenlawn in South Bend, Indiana. And so I said, well, I got running legs. I can always go back to journalism. But I not only won her hand, but teaching won my heart too. And I loved teaching. And I didn't start as a history teacher. I taught history several years later, and it was mostly a modern European history. In the last part of my career, just before I founded Cana Academy in 2016, I was teaching 12th grade Humane Letters, which was a seminar, a very rigorous seminar for our most advanced students. We're doing philosophy and theology and Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, Plato, Aristotle. But I taught 7th grade history. So right up into the last days of my teaching career, I was teaching the little guys how to understand the ancient world. So I taught Greek, Egyptian, Roman, and Near Eastern history. So I had a chance all these years to pass on and to grow in my own understanding of history, not only in terms of its content, but how to think about history and how best to kind of pass that culture of history on to our students. And one way to understand education is to understand it as the conveying of or the passing on of culture. And I think that to remember the past is dead center to who we are as human beings. I think Christians have an especial affinity for this. Christ said at the Last Supper, do this in memory of me. And there's a sense in which the summary of the Christian life is to live under history, under God's intervention, and under what Christ brought about. Our Jewish forebears had sort of the original sensibility. They lived under the events of Exodus. And, the Seder meal or the Passover meal has 4 cups of wine, all remembering the 4 levels of liberation. And the Israelites who finally took Israel were almost entirely men and women and children who had either been born after the events of Exodus or were converts. Their Scripture says only a couple of the originals who left Egypt were with them. So the only way for Israel to be a people, for the Jews to be a people, was to live under the memory of what God did for them. I think this is largely the form of history, or the form of life under history, is that something's been given to us, and we in turn need to recollect it for ourselves and live under those events. Now, that means, among other things, this is a field of freedom, divine and human, and God's freedom is unfailing and always true, and ours is not so. It fluctuates. So history becomes a drama too. It's like, how are we going to respond to what's been revealed to us, to what we remember, to what's been given us? So there's a great, you might say, a kind of a moral heart within history. History is not moral philosophy. History is not a call to action, and yet to remember is one of the most important things we can do.
So, you're bringing up the Jewish Seder and also the Last Supper, where Christ says, "Do this in remembrance of me." And then your reference to your own teachers who have passed on a tradition to you. Just remind me of some other ways in which traditionally we've tried to do this. For example, the church itself. In the Eastern Orthodox tradition, my tradition, we have icons painted in a church, and you're seeing all these people who've gone before you, tried to live the life that you want to live, and done it with enough holiness and notoriety that they're worth reflecting on. And there's in one church in our area, there's a lovely icon, life size, of Augustine, and he's holding a scroll that says, "The son of so many tears will never be lost," which is a remembrance of Monica going to Ambrose and asking for prayer, and her constant weeping for her own son. And Ambrose eventually says to Monica, Augustine's mother, "The son of so many tears will never be lost." It's a great comfort to those of us who are parents to see this and to remember just that story. And it's painted on the walls. And so I just wonder if, like, figuratively speaking, where, as a historian and as a teacher of history, where does an image like that or a practice like that take you when it comes to the classroom and the training of teachers and the study of history? How have you translated that into pedagogies and ways of thinking about the actual study of history in a K through 12 school?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and what a great set of images you present there. One thing comes to mind is that in the modern era, a very toxic notion of history has come to play, and that history is a force. Hegel and Marx were both practitioners of this, purveyors of this, and somehow or another, human agency seems to play a secondary role, and that we're kind of judged by history. But it's quite the opposite, actually, that human agency actually is dead center to history. And again, how we respond to what's been revealed to us, either divinely or historically, is part and parcel of who we are. The word person, of course, its historical roots are in ancient Greece, from the word prosopon, which literally meant the mask that the actor wore. And the mask or the person would mediate between the audience and the actor, between the audience and the playwright. So the catharsis that the Greek audience experienced, the purging of emotions and feelings and alliances and sympathies that were wrong, gave room now for what is true to their humanity. At the end of the festival in the spring, all the actors would take their persons, their masks, and put them on a fire and burn them in honor of Dionysus for the sake of the city. So the person was a mediator for the sake of everyone. It was a very public, a very communal role. This takes on much greater depth and height with Christianity, because in the person of Christ, who is both divine and human, we find the perfect mediator between God and all mankind. And wonderfully, like, you take the Christ Pantocrator, which might be the most famous icon in all of history. And he's a judge, right? That's what that means. But he's a merciful judge. And we engage the icon eye to eye. One contemplates, of course, the divinity of Christ, but you can't contemplate the divinity of Christ in that icon apart from his human countenance. So this is part and parcel of of how wondrous human agency is. It's been elevated by God through the incarnation. It's not just that we're created in God's image, it's that he became one of us. And so human agency takes on a new height and depth that it didn't have before Christianity. And later in history, and this is the kind of thing I would discuss with my students. Now, with younger students, I wouldn't talk so much in kind of philosophical terms, but to keep pointing back to what happened in history, which made these other things possible, is exactly the kind of narrative that I think our students in classical academies really benefit from. We'll give it one other practical example. Before the early Christians, who had no power and little wealth in pagan Rome, before they organized themselves to take care of the poor, nobody in history had ever organized themselves socially to do such a thing. And the reason they organized themselves is exactly because of who Christ was and what he did. He came to liberate the poor. He pointed to the poor and identified himself with them. It gave him the Good Samaritan story. The Samaritan, who was an outcast from Jewish society, became the standard for all of Christ's audience as to how to conduct mercy, how to exercise it. And now, we look around our world today and we say, well, it seems like we're more secular. It seems like, as Donald Kagan, the great historian, said, religion doesn't have a hold on culture the way it used to. And while we all need moral bearings, it looks like religion has less of a role to play in offering us religious bearings. But one thing that's true historically is that the permanent role of concern for the poor that occupies every Western country came to us by way of Christianity. So even if some people prefer welfare and the terms of social justice and so forth, the commitment to the poor who are inherently dignified comes to us only by way, it only has a hold on us by dint of history, and that's the history of the Christian people converting pagan Rome, largely through the practice of taking care of the poor. So those kind of things are stories they would tell. I tell you, we could talk about American stories. First of all, the founders read a lot more history than they did philosophy. And the Bible was the book quoted most in the Revolutionary era. If you mark it pretty much from, say, the 1760 to 1805, roughly, the Revolutionary era, the Bible is the most oft-quoted book. The favorite story from the Bible is the story of the Exodus. The most oft-cited book in the Bible is the book of Deuteronomy. And of all the, you could say all the individual writers within the Bible, St. Paul is he cited as much as Montesquieu among the founders, which is terribly interesting. So there's and we forget that because so often the American liberal order is reduced to a kind of autonomous individualism. And that freedom or liberty becomes license to do any darn thing you want to. But when we look closely at the American founders, they didn't think about freedom that way. You wouldn't call them philosophers, although you had philosophically trained men like Madison. You would have to recognize, however, that they thought of order, that freedom is ordered freedom. And it was freedom directly influenced by the Bible, by the inheritance of British rights, by the common law practiced by, articulated by William Blackstone. About half of the signers of the Declaration and the Constitution were lawyers, and they all would have been trained by Blackstone. And Blackstone taught them to think of the law in terms of legal precedent, which is a historical way to think about law, much like Montesquieu's methodology. He also taught them to think in terms of the civic law in relationship to the natural law. In the Dobbs case, which came down, a year or two ago, maybe 2 years ago, the case was largely determined around due process. And then the judges determined that there was no historical foundation for the claim that a woman has a right to abortion. One of the less noted parts of the case, there was an amicus brief written by Robert George and John Finnis. And they went back and they did a deep dive into the history of the concept of person. And one reason they did that is that in the Roe versus Wade decision, Blackmun, who wrote the majority decision, said that there was no historical reason to think that the unborn are covered under the notion of person as practiced at the time of the 14th Amendment. And Finnis and George slam dunked that. It's false. It's just utterly false. And they trace it all the way back in part to William Blackstone and his commentaries on the law, which was the number one cited book, a political book or legal book at the Constitutional Convention. These are all terribly interesting stories unto themselves, but you can gather what tremendous importance they hold for how young people understand their humanity. What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to have responsibility? What does it mean to live together in society under the past?
Well, helpful. And as you just pointed out, there are habits of thought, moral ideals that we have inherited that come from our predecessors. And we've acquired these kind of ideals and habits by a kind of absorption that's hard to pinpoint into a particular time. It's kind of in the cultural milieu or air. For example, you mentioned our concern for the poor, this compassion that we have for immigrants. We're an immigrant nation, and so it's natural that there are many people saying we should be welcoming people who are seeking a better way of life with some hospitality, and but we're also a country that has appreciated law and clarified law and the rule of law. We're a country based on a constitution, and so it's also natural that someone say, "Wait a minute, we want to welcome immigrants, but there's a way to do this that is appropriate and legal and responsible to the commitments we've made." And those two things are clashing right now. Some people are responding to immigration by saying, no illegals. We can't have illegal immigrants, and we need to remove them. And others are saying, we have to show compassion on people who are seeking a better way of life. Both of these things are rooted in something that we've inherited, some kind of moral ideals. And so some historians have talked about the present generation always being like the leaf at the end of a tree. But there's the tree, there's the branch, there's the root. We've come from somewhere. And if we don't study that, we don't even understand ourselves. Mm-hmm. And I think that's just fascinating that, I might have habits of being and as a parent that I've adopted because of my grandparents or great-grandparents, and it's just been passed down to me in ways I'm not conscious of. Could you comment on that, and then maybe take that thought and take us to a place to your thoughts about why American history is so important for us to study right now, and how it should be studied?
Did you want me to address the metaphor, the leaf at the end of the tree, or parenthood? What exactly?
I'm just thinking that this fact that we have received things that we're not even aware of consciously, and until we study history, we might not know that. It seems that by studying history, we become conscious of some of the good things we've received that really are gifts. So I think sometimes people don't understand they've received a gift.
Yes.
And that it's only by the study of history that we can see something as a gift and appreciate it with the appropriate respect. And also at times to say, I've also received some things that are not good and that need to be yet reformed or refined.
Yes. Oh, this is such an important area. David McCullough, who you might know was someone who would sort of lean to the Democratic side of the aisle, said something, however, that was absolutely true for all of us, and that is we seem to be losing our story. He said this in the middle of the 1990s, and it became even truer. He just died a year ago or 2 years ago, so it became even truer, I think, well into our century. But he said we're losing our story, and in losing our story, we're losing a sense of who we are. More recently, Victor Davis Hanson, who kind of leans to the opposite side of the political aisle, also said something true for all of us, and that is there's a growing phenomenon. It reflects kind of what you were just talking about. He calls it the dying citizen. And it's the individual who claims American freedoms, but either out of sort of passive ignorance or willful neglect, doesn't know where those freedoms came from and what responsibilities attend the free citizen. And I think that this is a very toxic problem. And this is, I wouldn't want to point to any one reason why we ought to have classical education, but one very impelling one is that there's a huge epidemic of amnesia in America. People are simply forgetting. They're forgetting the Western heritage, the Christian heritage, our American heritage, and so forth. And one might say, well, how relevant is it? So what fruit is actually born from remembrance? And here's where I think it ties so nicely so importantly to your other observation, and that is there are things that we remember that are not so good. They're not life-giving. They're not creative. In fact, every society has its failings. America has some glaring failings. At the founding, we had the convergence of American freedom and American slavery. And remarkably, some of the greatest voices of American freedom were right here in my home state in Virginia. You think of Washington, Jefferson, Madison, Monroe, Mason. They were all marvelous men of thought and action devoted to American freedom, and all slaveholders. And there's a great book written by the late historian from Yale named Edmund Morgan. He wrote a book called American Slavery, American Freedom, and he calls it the Great American Paradox. And he does an sort of without pulling any punches, he does a very deep dive into the growth of American slavery in Virginia. And remarkably, much to some people's chagrin, he says, I still don't think of the founders as monsters, and I don't reject what they had to say about liberty. How could this be? Well, no less than Frederick Douglass, a former slave, who was hotly critical of what he perceived to be the cynicism of Christians, Republicans, and humanists for upholding slavery, looked at the Constitution and called it a glorious liberty document, and he didn't see any constitutional foundation for slavery. Lincoln, at the Gettysburg battlefield, when he gave his famous address, he looked at the founding of 77 years ago, tapped the Declaration in that regard. But he said, instead of using the word self-evident truth, he said, we need to prove the proposition that all men are created equal. How do we do that? Well, in the moment, they had to win the war over the South, and they had to free the slave. Later on, he would say in his second inaugural address that we need to move forward with malice toward none and charity toward all. So Lincoln, who probably, who suffered terribly in kind of religious terms, I think he had deep doubts about faith, and he wasn't really a practicing Christian as such. He was raised in a Baptist house, but is there a president who ever knew the Bible better than Abraham Lincoln? I don't think so. Truman read it multiple times, and most of the early presidents all knew their Bible well, but I think Lincoln, at least rhetorically, mastered it in a way that nobody else did. But in invoking malice and charity, he was speaking biblically to the nation. And so not only recalling who we are as one nation, he was recalling who we are as a people under God. And what we understand to be a people under God is principally from the scriptures and from the tradition that pours forth from that. You go from 1863 to 1963, and from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, Martin Luther King Jr. invokes Lincoln and the founding. And he says, the founding is like a promissory note. It needs to be paid up. And now's the time. So if we're going to finally do this, we need to get rid of segregation so that all people can can live under that beautiful and eternal truth that all men are created equal. We had other examples that we could talk about. In the migrant workers movement that was led by Cesar Chavez, there was a terrible set of events also in the 60s, and farm workers were being treated badly for having gone on strike, and Chavez went on a hunger strike. And I forget how many days it was, but it was long. I think it was pushing 40 days. And at the end of the strike, he broke the strike by taking communion. And by his side was Robert F. Kennedy. And Chavez was so weak he couldn't read the speech, but his wife read the speech. And among other things, he says, "True men of courage are not men of violence, but are men who, out of nonviolence, stand up for what is true." And in doing that, he tapped his own Catholic faith, which is a remarkable thing. So, and I say that not because all Americans are Catholic, but rather there is a man like the founders, like Lincoln, like Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Baptist, who invoked his faith to find his bearings for how to live as an American. And there are lots of examples that we could point to, but America, is nothing if it's not a place devoted to freedom and the quest for freedom, which means, among other things, we're trying to do better. And we don't always do better, but sometimes we do. And the stories of the men and women who stand up and recall the past in order to remedy the present, okay, that's pay dirt. That's the kind of history that is just life-changing, and the kind of stories that we do well to tell our students.
Yes, you're bringing up a very interesting component to our American historical tradition, which I think sometimes we've forgotten or we just can't see because it's the water we swim in. And it's this: Americans are always trying to improve, to refine, to do better, to innovate, and to critique what we've received. Right? In other words, the American tradition is love for the tradition, but it's also critique. Because the ideals in the Constitution and the founding, they're ideals that are hard to realize, and we're still working on realizing them. And so this idea of, debate, argument, discussion, respectful discourse about how to be just, it's still with us. We always welcome a critique, but it seems like without history, that critique just becomes ignorant, and it becomes kind of blind, and it becomes absent of respect, and a kind of appropriate esteem and respect for the tradition.
Yeah, so you beautifully articulated in kind of a summary of the best kind of education, which fosters discourse, civic respect toward the other, but under the tutelage of men and women who've come before us and who did the same thing, who engaged public discourse and public service and self-sacrifice. There is an abiding sense in Western heritage, of self-criticism. Like we are by habit in the West always looking to find the truth wherever we can find it. But that only works in a kind of conservation of what came before us. Socrates models this for us. He never left Athens except to defend her on the battlefield. And when offered the chance to die in Athens or move on and do philosophy someplace else, he said, no, I'm going to stay here. And the last thing he did was to die in a way that showed an example to his friends and to his city. It also showed a fundamental reverence for the laws of Athens. He'd been reared by Athens. He owed his life to Athens. He was willing to give his life for Athens. So philosophy, although sometimes we abstract it as a way of life, devoted to the transcendentals and so forth, it very much in the biography of Socrates, it was city-founded, civic-oriented. It's for the good of the common, and not just for the benefit of the elite philosophers. I would say also we look in, some of our statesmen, our most noted characters in history are fallen characters. I mentioned the slaveholders. You get a guy like John F. Kennedy, who on a personal level did not live a righteous life. Isn't it remarkable, however, that when he goes to the Berlin Wall in 1963, not only does he express a fundamental solidarity with the people of Germany, especially the people of Berlin, and he pulls up for that purpose poetry by John Donne, and who beautiful line about if one man dies, that there's a sense in which it's a loss for everyone, right? In the main, and the whole kit and caboodle is not the same anymore. And Kennedy rhetorically took that and he said, if any one man is not free, the rest of us are not free. And so I stand here as a free man. He didn't say solidarity, but he was standing in solidarity. He said, "Ich bin ein Berliner," which means I'm with you. I'm one of you insofar as you're suffering from a lack of freedom. The historian George Weigel once asked Pope John Paul II, he said, what did you learn from living under Nazism and communism? And the Pope said that he learned about the catastrophic suffering of his neighbors, and that impelled him to dedicate the rest of his life to being a priest, that he was willing to engage in personal and ritual sacrifice for the sake of those who suffered around him. I think that I think those kind of examples are so powerful. And so you look at a JFK and a JP2, wow, wildly different figures, moving in kind of different directions. And however, one thing that kind of holds them together is the pulling up of, the recollecting of the past to give voice to what needs to be said today. And speaking of JP2 in America, was in the mid-'90s. I think it was mid-'90s. Don't quote me on that, but it might have been his last trip to America. He was leaving the country and was at the Baltimore airport, and he invoked what he called America's moral bulwark. And what he meant by that were our founding documents, the Declaration, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights. And he said, in there is a clear articulation of principles of natural law by which you can look at the person as inherently dignified and worthy, whose life is worthy to protect. So you Americans, he charged us, live by that, live by your bulwark. And it's a bulwark against moral skepticism. So I think when students take a deep dive into our founding documents, it's very difficult for them, if they're taught well, it's very difficult and unlikely for them to pop out moral skeptics. If they do a deep dive in the poetry of John Donne or the natural law thinking of Cicero or Thomas Aquinas or Blackstone, again, it's this is the kind of training that keeps them from falling off the edge intellectually, morally, spiritually. And then you add to it all the beautiful poetry and the icons of the past and the wonderful artwork of Gilbert Stuart and Bellows and the other great artists of American tradition. All this gives us not only shared knowledge, but it gives us common sympathies. So we stand in front of a wonderful painting and we feel something we ought to feel, and we feel it together, and that gives us a way to situate our lives in the world. I think what happened in the last century was a disaster in terms of education. About a half century of progressive education just assailed against liberal disciplines, against classic works of literature, against moral realism or natural law thinking, and then we were left wide open for the assault that came our way after World War II with the arrival of the New Left in the academy, which went after everything American, everything Western, everything Christian, if we saw an explosion of American culture, implosion of American culture in the 1960s with the sexual revolution and the student uprisings, and compounded by badly managed war in Vietnam, by corruption in the White House, multiple presidents being corrupt. All this just kind of ripped the American spirit. It took the confidence out from underneath our feet. And it's no mistake, I think, that we saw, starting in the late 70s, early 80s, a revival of what we call a classical education or liberal education. It was a necessity. It was an absolute necessity. It was like if we didn't recover that, the whole ship might be lost, because no more could we let generations fall to forgetfulness. And by there I mean not just the study of history, but the absorption of culture, which is an historical phenomenon. It's, again, to educate is to pass on our culture, which inherently is of historical origin and preservation.
So you're calling to mind that famous quote by Chesterton, where he says that education is the transmission of the soul of society from one generation to another. But another place he says is telling the truth to the next baby born. So that it's both this large thing of cultural transmission and this very concrete thing of specific instruction to a child. I wonder if you could build on this contrast of progressive and liberal or classical education and talk about what you think should be done now in history instruction. You're leading Cana Academy. You've written a book, History Forgotten and Remembered, where you're talking about the importance of recovering history as a kind of practice of respectful remembering. And then you've engaged in this big project called America 250. And I'm imagining all three of those endeavors are part of your mission to bring good remembrance to education again. Could you talk about those three things?
Sure. We actually call our film project History 250. There is a big muscular organization called America 250. It's doing all sorts of things, especially for the semi-quincentennial. Cana Academy, we founded in 2016, and we call it Cana partly, obviously, out of reverence and remembrance of the Gospel of John and the wedding feast of Cana story. But I might say maybe more directly, we were invoking the dream version of the wedding feast story found in the Brothers Karamazov. So you and your listeners will recall that Alyosha was under terrible crisis at every level, personal, social, spiritual, and his mentor, Father Zwerneman, had died, and scandalously, the wise father's body was corrupting in a way that just was causing great havoc in the monastery. And anyway, poor Alyosha collapses by his corpse and falls to sleep. And there's a priest there reading the gospel, and then in his dream, Alyosha ascends to the eternal wedding feast, the eternal banquet, and there's Father Zosma, there's the governor of the feast, our Lord. And with each moment, new members are arriving, in this heavenly vision. But it's strange. It's a convergence of the earthly and the heavenly, because after all, Alyosha is there, and his mentor, his beautiful mentor, Father Zosma, is there too, and others are arriving from this life in the next life. So that wonderful Dostoevsky vision where the two worlds kind of open up to each other, and we have this magnificent kind of mystic unitive experience is portrayed so powerfully there. When he comes out of the dream, he goes outside and he looks up to the heavens and he looks to the earth, and then in very Russian fashion he throws himself on the earth and embraces it. And it's very inadequate, but what else are you going to do, right? Just act out of love for what's been given you. And then he gets up and he knows what he has to do. He knows what he has to do with his crazy father, his crazy carnal father, his tumultuous brothers and their tumultuous women, all the poor boys in the village who were more or less fatherless or mentorless. And so everyone who needs him now will receive what he can give them because he's been restored. So we founded Cana Academy as an effort to help restore things. There are a lot of people who are lost in our culture, and we think a good road into restoration is to help teachers find their bearings so they can help their students find their bearings. And how do we do that? Well, we read and we study and we create in ways that are true to the humanity that's been given us, the humanity that's been revealed to us, and the humanity that's been revealed both divinely and humanly. That is, God has made himself known in his Son, and all sorts of wonderful men and women have demonstrated for us how to live, how to create, how to exercise their freedom. Or they've also demonstrated how we need to look at the tumultuous life that human existence is. So, again, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., John Paul II, Cesar Chavez, all these men had looked to the past and they said, okay, here's a way to look at the suffering caused by humans. So as Solzhenitsyn says, good and evil cut through the heart of every human. So, we should not be surprised if history is a drama. It can break toward order, it can break toward disorder. So the best education will pay attention to the movements of the heart. And this will be explored through, as you were invoking St. Augustine, will be invoked in great books like the Confessions. Augustine says, among other things, we are what we love, right? So it means that education needs to order the loves of our students. It also needs to invoke the great loves of the past. What are the most normative loves of the past? Well, the love of wisdom, which in its form was discovered and exercised for the first full time in ancient Greece. The love of God and neighbor, which we think was revealed and exercised in ancient Israel. Passed on, of course, those two well springs converge in the Middle Ages in Rome, and we get the Western culture at its best since then. And it's figures just like Augustine who represent both of those streams of love, streams of insight. It's precisely out of that convergence that we get an explosion of art, unprecedented in all of history, in the West, that is. And that is, the explosion happens in the West. It's no surprise that in the West, with its concern for the person, revealed first in ancient Greece and then most deeply and most broadly and with greatest height through Christianity, with its deep roots in Judaism, that we get a dedication to the person in politics and law. Has it been perfect? No way. It's a very fluctuating, undulating history. However, if you look around the world today, there are more slaves than there ever have been in history, but they're mostly in non-Western countries, which doesn't make the West perfect, but it does remind us that the West has an answer to slavery. And it took a long time for the West to get its act together to do that in England and in America and elsewhere.
Language of human rights, right? The language of human rights is derivative from this love of the person and respect and esteem for the person.
Yeah, but it has to be devoted to the love of the person to hold its bearings, because as we see under Jacobin influence in the French Revolution, very, very radical, every communist constitution in the world gives lip service to human rights. But that's not to say that the Jacobins or the communists give credence to personhood. And what we understand by personhood, we learn from the Bible and from Greek literature and Roman paternal piety and so forth. So I hope that's a start to an answer to your question. Don't want to just keep talking.
But maybe we could round off by going to this place. I'd like to ask you to describe, if you will, what you would see in a great classical, say, upper school from, say, 7th through 12th grade when it comes to the matter of teaching history or the liberal arts or the great books. If that school existed and we were taking a tour, tell me what we would see, what we would hear, what kind of conversations would be going on. What would that school be like?
All right. So our latest project, History 250, is a set of short films on the most important and most interesting events in American history. Each film abides by the liberal discipline of history. So if the short answer to your question is the school should abide by the liberal discipline of history and not give in to an ideological form of history. What Howard Zinn and 1619 Project are doing, that's not true history. You have to see the past in its pastness, which means people are different. The exercise of human freedom is going to have iterations that we won't recognize as the same that we see around us today. And yet there's a commonality because we observe in our forebears the first lessons of our humanity. What are some major features of the liberal discipline of history? First of all, historians deal in concrete features, and these are the things that students need to learn how to work up. So I mentioned earlier the habits of mind, observation and sympathy. So we need to be observational, look at the past for what it is, what actually happened, and not reduce it to something that we want it to be. It can't be any false intentions. And secondly, it needs to be sympathetic, which means we can't moralize. We can't dismiss people in the past because they're different from us or dismiss it for their failures. We need to see, in fact, we can never judge something evil or a failure unless we recognize it under the scope of what's good. And that means a comprehensive understanding of what it means to be human. And that includes theology, philosophy, art, history, etc. But in terms of history, once you understood that you're fostering those habits, you do it through the study of concrete things. This is where kind of the nuts and bolts of history happens. And maybe people go, oh, it's not as interesting as philosophy. But it's very interesting if you approach it observationally and sympathetically. Historians work up imagery. What do I mean by that? Portraiture, maps, photographs of artifacts, photographs and maps and portrait and paintings of places. So history happens someplace and it involves someone always. History always deals with the singular. One of the reasons some people, even in our movement, don't really like history all that much is it doesn't deal in the universal. Philosophy always deals in the universal. History always deals in the singular. And it deals in singular events with singular persons at the heart of their events. Now, because persons are persons, history always has to deal with the person. And that makes history always important. Like we're always looking at the person who is the fundamental agent of mediation. Like persons mediate between other persons and between the persons who can give them life and the persons who would take their life. So remember in the abolition movement, there was no good argument left on the table in defense of slavery, and yet the Brits couldn't quite get to the point where they abolished slavery. And then Josiah Wedgwood devised that famous medallion of a black slave in chains on his knee, and there were two questions. The one said, "Am I not a man? Am I not your brother?" The one is a humanist question. The other was a biblical question. In other words, the black slave, and that helped push them over the top. They got to abolition in no small measure because of the medallion. The person of the slave mediated between all slaves and those who could do something about it. When Lincoln stood at Gettysburg, he said, "Look, the world will long remember us for certain things, and the thing we need to be remembered for is that we freed the slave." And we've got to win this war. We got to free the slave. Otherwise, the proposition that we stand on, a government of, for, and by the people, makes no sense if a large sector, 4 million Americans, remain unfree. So Lincoln mediated between his audience and the slaves, between the Union and the divided country. And all the examples that I gave you so far, each person that I pointed to, you can consider in those terms. He's a mediator. So students need to look at that and say, okay, this is what's going on. The singular person is of a huge importance in these singular events. They don't necessarily give us universal lessons. What Lincoln said doesn't necessarily, winning this war now may not be the way to respond to this particular crisis. So you got Lincoln, who leads the effort to win the war as a war with military force, and you got Martin Luther King Jr. and Cesar Chavez leading nonviolent action to win the culture war over the rights of migrants and the rights of American blacks in segregated cities. So again, history doesn't necessarily give you a universal lesson, but it does, as with Aristotle's rhetoric, where he says past cases help you make a more convincing case. We turn to history to help us make the case for what kind of course of action. So they had imagery. Okay, that's the first thing they deal with. The second thing they deal with are individual and group narratives. So an individual narrative would be Douglas's autobiography. Group narratives would be all those wonderful notes that our Puritan forebears kept. Or if you go to the Library of Congress, you can listen to interviews with hundreds of former slaves to tell you what life was like on the plantation. What's his name? James McPherson, who might be our greatest Civil War historian, wrote a very short monograph on why Union and Confederate soldiers went to war. And he did it in no small measure because an interesting narrative had emerged in American history over the course of the 20th century. That there's this famous documentary film footage of former enemies going to battlefields for reunions, and then over the line of demarcation, they all shake hands, and there's a lot of bone on me, and and the growing narrative was that, well, it's just a terrible misunderstanding among brothers, and McPherson says, wait a second, what actually happened, if you look at their letters and their diaries, they went to war for very different reasons. They had common ground. They each invoked American liberty, but what they meant by liberty was radically different from each other, and if at first Union soldiers didn't go to war because of slavery, they later went to war once they moved down into the South. They started to encounter slaves for the first time in their lives. They go, wow, this is horrible. Slavery is a terrible thing. It's a terrible cruelty. And again, the slave mediated between the soldier and the rest of the country. It mediated between the soldier and his motivations. Like he had a different vision of what it meant to go to war on behalf of the North going into the war than he did after he encountered slavery. And so, and McPherson says, if you look at those first film clips, you will note that there are no black soldiers around. Now, this is the time of failed Reconstruction, and McPherson says, in no small measure, in the Jim Crow era, it's largely due to forgetfulness. That we forgot our motivations, we forgot what the war was fought for, and then this kind of sentimental narrative emerged. So the historian always goes back to the sources and say, what really happened? And one way to get into what really happened is to go to those individual and group narratives. A third thing, they do what's called structural analysis. So they take something like, so you could read a wonderful book of American history like The Land of Hope by Wilford McClay. At any juncture, however, McClay is working through substructures of the American polity, the American story. So, for example, not so much McClay, but say Forrest McDonald, another great American story, did a whole history of America looking at the Constitution and the Supreme Court. So he would look at, for example, the history of judicial review. You could put your finger on Marbury versus Madison on one end, and you could put your finger, roughly, 130 years later, 30 plus years later, in Brown versus Board of Education. And that movement of time forms an arc of change. So there was the eruptive event of Marbury, which establishes judicial review, and then there's finally an explosion of judicial activism, starting roughly in the middle of the last century. Now, Brown, segregation was bad. The whole idea that you could have separate and equal schools, that was a failed concept, and the court was right. But the court also everyone thinks, I think, all historians think that the court overreached. They tried to engineer integration where they simply ought to have just dealt with legal segregation. But my point here is that you could look at the history of America through our laws, and one way to look at our law is to look at judicial review. You could do something similar with World War II strategies. We had to liberate Europe from the south. We went from North Africa up through Sicily and Italy, and we had to liberate it from the northwest through Normandy, through France, and then into Germany. And those strategies are discernible to the eye. Like, you could get your arms around them. And Donald Kagan and his cohorts, Osmond and Turner, in their book, The Western Heritage, have a magnificent chapter on the strategies employed by the Allies to liberate Europe from the South and from the North. Those are great structures for students to enter into. There's a kind of pay dirt of sympathy and moral impulse when you return to a place like Normandy. You go to the American cemetery and you see the thousands of gravestones there. And every year they're kept beautifully, meticulously cared for. Architects designed the whole cemetery. And when pilgrims go there, they stand on hallowed ground. There's every gravesite is marked by a Roman cross or a Star of David, which is not to say that all the men who died were either righteous or saintly. It is to say, for most of them, or maybe all of them, they not only died for the sake of their families and for their neighbors in France and all across Europe, they reconciled their lives to something greater than any one of those historical events, and that is to God, the God of Israel and the God of the Incarnation. But there's a sense in which the study of history has to get there. Like, we have to understand what the price paid was before we understand just how hallowed that ground is. And we have to understand the history of Christianity and Judaism and their roles in the American founding and in the American moral imagination before we get to a recognition. A return to hallowed ground at Normandy is far richer if the pilgrim has read the sermons of Jonathan Edwards, or the famous sermon of Wilberforce, where he talked about freedom, and is much richer if they read Washington's famous letter to the Hebrew synagogue. Much richer for the story of Charles Carroll, who, like other Catholics, lost their religious rights in Maryland only to regain them after the American Revolution, and having given himself over to the Revolution, and was a Catholic who signed the Declaration and the Constitution. These are requisite stories, and historians work them up. They work up these narratives, the imagery, the structural analyses, and data, like the numbers. What are the numbers? Isn't it interesting that at the first kind of overwhelming victory for the American forces in the Revolutionary War, we way outnumbered the Brits at Saratoga, way outnumbered them. Victor Davis Hanson argues in his wonderful book, The Second World Wars, that there's really no sense in which the Japanese and the Germans ever had a numerical chance to win the war. That if you can measure it by things like this. If you look at the comparative gross domestic products of all the countries involved in the war, the American economy alone laps the Axis powers, by the end of the war. And so our ability, for example, to recover after Pearl Harbor and to, build up our Navy again was phenomenal. At the same time, the war World War II was a war of choice. That is, certain individuals making certain decisions at certain times made all the difference in the world. The Japanese didn't come back to Pearl Harbor a final time where they could have destroyed a lot more, for example, our petroleum supply. The Germans made the fatal error of trying to fight a war on both fronts and completely divided themselves. And Hitler just plain forgot, the whole story of Napoleon, getting overstretched, trying to beat the Russians on Russia's in the winter. What a disastrous course of action. There was a good case of a man who thankfully didn't pay attention to the past. And then, finally, maybe one more example that's kind of important for students is there are individuals who just plain dig in and remember where remembrance is utterly necessary. One of our most unphilosophical presidents was Eisenhower, but Eisenhower, when he walked into Ohrdruf, which was part of the concentration camp network, he directed the American forces to record everything they saw when liberating the camps, because he predicted that people in the future will declare that propaganda and that it didn't really happen. How prescient was that? I think things like that are really important. And then, so I would say that a really good history text is helpful. A book by Maclay, a book by Kagan helps the students get their arms around the whole of a society, either Western society or American society. But they also need to dig down and do a lot of very singular study, the study of documents, maps. They need to learn how to read a military map, for example, and the movements of battalions over the course of a battle. They need to understand geography. Every civilization in history has been founded someplace very particular. Our geography made all the difference in World War II, that we're not close to any of the major sectors of battle. Sicily was the big kahuna in the Punic Wars. Normandy was vital for the ongoing wars for 7 or 8 centuries between England and France. And the last time it was militarily important was on D-Day. Geography matters hugely. Why Athens was a maritime power and not Sparta? Well, it had largely to do with where they developed, right? So these kinds of things, I think, are the kinds of things we want our students to develop. But one thing that guys like Maclay and Kagan and great writers like Thucydides do is they help the students develop the art and the habit of narrative. That is not just important to know the singulars of the past. You need to pull them together as a story, because to live under history is to live under a story, a shared story about who we are. And again, our Jewish forebears, I think, are the first ones in history to exercise that. And that's most importantly evident in how what's left of the Hebrew people going into Israel, who we will now call Jews, going forth, really the only way they could survive was to live under a shared history. And the only way that Christians can hold together is by living under their shared history. The only way the West and America can hold together is by living under a shared history. It's a history that collects everything that we ought to know and ought to love, and all the men and women and children who suffered, who endured, who paid great costs, as Lincoln said, to the last full measure. And we find there ordered basic knowledge that meets the great sympathies of the heart. And that's why history is so close to story. Mortimer Adler said, take your pencil and underline the second and third syllables in the word. And it's not fiction, but it's not philosophy either. It's a different way of thinking. And along with imaginative literature and philosophical thinking or expository thinking, history is one of the most important things that we can cultivate among our students.
Thank you, Andrew. As you're speaking, other thoughts and maxims and quotations keep floating through my head. And just recently, as you were concluding there, I thought of that line from one of Faulkner's novels that, the history's not dead, it's not even past. Right? The realities of the past are present with us, whether we know it or not. And we are in need of living under a shared story, as you put it, or even mapping our own personal stories onto a larger shared story that creates meaning and also kind of just a purpose. Like, what could I be? is to a large extent determined by who my ancestors were, and their vices, their virtues, their folly, their wisdom, their holiness, their sin, all can inspire me and help me and be a kind of guide. So there's so many wonderful things that are being woven together in what you've shared about a kind of renewed remembrance of history that's sympathetic and ordered. So appreciate it. Can you tell our listeners or viewers how they can find out more about you? A couple of websites, maybe mention your book again, where they can find it.
Thanks a lot. So Cana Academy is housed at www.canaacademy.org. And if you go to our shop, you can read a free preview of any of our publications, including History Forgotten and Remembered, the book that I wrote in 2020. The second website, which is a project of Cana Academy, is www.history250. So it's the word history and the number 250.org. And there's a body of short films. In support of that, we're also building out a bank of original documents and maps so that teachers can utilize these as kind of a one-stop shop for putting together a good lesson. We're building out these films, and we're terribly excited about them as a way to exercise exactly what you just said, that is a need to remember again. We're inspired by those who came before us. We take our cue by following great historians. I'm personally inspired by a line from T.S. Eliot's, goes something like this, not verbatim, but Eliot says, see, the dead return, and we were born with them. And I think that's so true. So while past events are no longer, mysteriously we're bound to them and to the persons who were at the center of them. Just like mysteriously we're bound to our posterity. How interesting that the founders dedicated themselves not just to the living, but in memory of the dead and toward the lives of those they would never meet. And I think that's maybe the final way I would say that persons mediate. Like you and I and all those who are living, we kind of hold together the living to the dead and the living to the yet to be born. History is absolutely imperative for that. So you can go to those places and find our resources. A lot of them are free. Our History 250 is 100% free. We want this to be a big gift to cultural renewal. And it's sort of like making a really good medicine free for all the sick in a pandemic. If there's great amnesia in America, we want to help everybody remember again who we are. And it's a gift of love, and it's a gift also we offer with a lot of, we hope with inspiration and with fun too. So there are going to be some really fun episodes, like the birth of our favorite sports, football, basketball, and baseball. We're going to revisit some of the best movies ever produced, like Casablanca, for example. And along the way, we will engage in the memory of those who came before us. And the whole collective enterprise is a return to hallowed ground, the meaning of a divine and human freedom. And our team doesn't want to go out of this world without doing what we can to help restore things. So while we have time, while we have freedom, while we have the space and the resources, that's what we're going to do. So History 250, check it out.
History250.org.
Yeah.
And I would also just add that if you're just getting someone to share this video or this audio with you, at classicalacademicpress.com, we have two curricular lines that are trying to do something similar to what Andrew is sharing. One is called The Curious Historian for middle school students. It's 3 levels and will soon be 4. And then we have an upper school curriculum called Humanitas. And we have the American built out primary sources curated with the kind of beautiful art that Andrew was mentioning as well. So take a look at those if that's of interest to you. And once again, thank you, Andrew, for being with us. It's really been an enjoyable conversation. I appreciate so much what you're doing.
Well, thank you, Chris. I very much appreciate the invitation, and I enjoyed our conversation a lot. I look forward to others.
Likewise.
True North.